Cycles of Power. Steve was up early the next morning, even though it was a Saturday. The pressure he felt wouldn't let him sleep. He knew he needed an escape, even if only for a few hours. With dawn breaking, he went to the garage and pulled the cover off the majestic motorcycle that was his pride and joy. He rolled the gleaming Harley out to the street, strapped on his helmet, and threw his leg over the saddle. He started the motor and revelled in the powerful sound. He would spend this day as a wheeled warrior. He shifted into gear and headed off. Thundering along the road, he realized there were so many things he loved about motorcycling. The proverbial wind in his face was only a small part of it. As he contemplated the joys of riding, he felt a sense of mastery over what he realized was actually a pretty inept machine. After all, a motorcycle couldn't even stand up by itself. Steve loved the synergy of riding, the melding of human and machine that gave capabilities and power to both that neither possessed separately. The magic of the moment was interrupted when the bike started sputtering and slowing down. He pulled over to take a look. He had been off the bike for no more than a few minutes when he heard another cycle pull up. There's an unwritten code among bikers, so Steve knew it must be a biker stopping to see if he could be of service. Need any help? The voice sounded familiar. He looked up from the wiring he'd been fiddling with and his jaw dropped open. "Kayla," he said, flabbergasted. Kayla looked as surprised as Steve. "Wow, isn't this a coincidence?" "Somehow I don't think so," Steve said. "You know, when I met you at the cafe, I thought you looked familiar, and now I think I know why." "Are you an HOG?" Kayla asked. "Yeah, I am, but I haven't been to a Harley owner group meeting for months," Steve said. "So how'd it go with your team yesterday?" Steve gave a non-committal shrug. "I'm guessing," Kayla continued, "but tell me if I'm wrong. Yesterday you accepted responsibility, challenged assumed constraints, and decided to fight for your job and the client. The problem is you don't know where to begin. You feel powerless." "There you go again, reading my mind." Steve shook his head, not knowing what to believe. "But you're right. That's why I took time out for a ride." Kayla looked at Steve's cycle. "What happened?" she asked. "She died on me," he said. "He tested the ignition, but nothing happened. I know I've got plenty of gas, so it's probably a bad battery or fouled spark plug." He rummaged through his saddlebag, searching for a spare set of plugs. "Let me help," Kayla said, as she pulled a spare set from underneath her seat. "Are you sure these aren't trick plugs?" Steve asked, only half kidding. Kayla seemed not to hear his comment. "It's a shame that help like this isn't more common in the real world, isn't it?" Steve wasn't sure if Kayla was speaking of the real world outside of cycling enthusiasts, or the real world outside of the strange one created every time he met her. Kayla continued, "Listen, there's a dealer close by. Why don't you follow me over there where you can replace the plugs I loaned you?" "I didn't know there was a shop around here," Steve said. "Yeah, Hal's Harleys. I've been going there for years." "Hal's?" Steve recognized the name. "Hal's is legendary. I didn't know it was around here. Sounds like a good plan to me." They fired up their engines, and Kayla took the lead. Soon Steve was again immersed in the pure joy of riding, wondering why it gave him such a thrill. He was so engrossed in his own thoughts that he almost missed Kayla's signal as she took a left off the road. A few yards farther down, they turned left again into the Harley-Davidson dealership. Before Steve could dismount, Kayla was standing beside him, helmet and glasses already off. "Power." Kayla spoke the word in a resonant voice that evoked its meaning. Steve was confused. "Excuse me?" "Power," Kayla repeated. "It's why you love to ride." Steve started to freak out. "How did you know I was thinking about? I'm a keen observer, remember? I've seen that look before. I've had that look before. Where you are lost in the joy of riding and you're not quite sure why. Well, I know why. It's the power, the knife-edged control, and the independence that riding offers." "I'm not sure I agree it's about power and control," Steve countered. "Riding is fun, pure and simple." "When did you start riding?" Kayla asked. Steve enjoyed reliving the story of his love affair with motorcycles. He told her about riding on the back of his dad's motorcycle, hardly able to wait until he was old enough to ride for himself. When he was 13, he'd talked his dad into buying him a small scooter. At 16, he'd made his first road trip, riding from Denver to Nebraska state line with his younger brother. "I loved the feeling of independence and freedom from all the rules and regulations I lived with in school," he said. "But I wasn't on a power trip. Maybe you should reconsider the way you define power. Kayla suggested gently. Words began to flow through Steve's head. Abuse, corruption, coercion, control, authority, manipulation, money, domination. Kayla studied him closely. Interesting, she said. I imagine that most of the words you're thinking about are negative because you've seen power misused so much. Steve opened his mouth to comment, but Kayla threw out another question. Have you ever known someone who was in a powerful position, but you have no respect for them, she said. Silly question, thought Steve. Of course I have. In addition to a couple of executive types at work, he could add a number of politicians as well as Roger from United Bank. Kayla nodded as though agreeing with his unspoken thoughts. Lord Acton wrote, Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Steve, think about all the negative stereotypes we have about power today. It's a wonder anyone would ever want to be powerful. I guess you're right, Steve admitted, but I'm not sure where you're going with this discussion. I think you're trying to avoid power, and I'm trying to help you embrace it. In a way, you already do. Me embrace power? Like when? When you ride your bike, what you love about riding is the sense of power, the power of being one with the bike, the power that brings you a sense of control. When you ride, you feel free. Compare this feeling to the way you feel about your work right now. Steve groaned. He was trying not to think about work for a couple of hours, and he sure didn't want to compare riding to work. Do you feel powerful at work? Kayla challenged. Being an account executive on United Bank should have made him feel empowered and free to do great work. Instead, he felt restricted, stifled by others' expectations of him, burdened by his lack of experience with creative types, confused by a difficult client, and threatened by people such as Rhonda, who were in positions that allowed them to determine his fate. Right now, he certainly didn't have the feeling of being one with his job. In fact, I feel powerless, he confessed. Why do you think you feel that way? Kayla asked. Because I'm not in a position to get people to do what I want them to do, Steve replied emphatically. Isn't that interesting? Kayla strapped her helmet on the back of her bike and said, Not realizing your own power could be your greatest assumed constraint. As she led him into the shop, Kayla said, I want to introduce you to some people I think you'll appreciate. They all have discovered there are a lot of ways to influence others and achieve their goals. We'll start with Woody, one of the best parts managers in the country. Knows most of the part numbers by heart. It's amazing. Just watch. They walked up to the parts counter, and Kayla was greeted warmly by a gracious young man. Hey, Kayla. What can we do for you? The world treating you okay? He extended a hand and smiled brightly. Kayla gave him a hearty handshake. Yeah, or at least it will, if you'll get my friend here a set of standard spark plugs. And can you ask one of the boys to check his electrical system? The beast died a few miles from here and I had to rescue him. Kayla gave Steve a just teasing jab in the arm. The young man nodded at Steve. Bike's not dead, right? Just resting? He smiled back at Kayla, cupped his hands together and yelled, Joey, pull me a set of 32310 78As. Steve did a double take. The young man hadn't even looked up the part number. Kayla smiled mischievously and turned back to the parts counter. By the way, Woody, I'd like to introduce you to Steve. Steve, meet Woody, parts manager extraordinaire. Woody pulled out an order form. Glad to help you with the parts, but first let me give you my standard song and dance. At that, Woody stood at attention, cleared his throat, and in a rich baritone recited, I stand behind the counter in a motorcycle store. Sometimes I'm called a genius, sometimes I'm called much more. Some questions are important, some questions aren't, but oh my lord, I'm supposed to be an Edison combined with Henry Ford. I claim I'm no mechanic, but when the job goes sick, the mechanic comes and asks me what makes the darn thing tick. But life would be a pleasure, and I'd grin from ear to ear, if the customer'd only tell me the model, make and year. Steve laughed and promptly gave Woody the requisite model, make and year. As he completed the order form, Woody called out to the parts man behind him, I'll also need a 3259180 and a set of 31986 65Cs. Thanks, Joey. Steve was impressed. That's quite a skill you have there. How did you memorize all those part numbers? Oh, there's a method to the madness. Once you understand the underlying principle behind the numbering system, it's not that hard. Woody pointed at Kayla. Actually, she's the one who helped me realize that knowing the system of part numbers is an important point of power. It's really helped me build credibility in this industry. I've had a terrific career, and I don't even have a tattoo." Kayla cast a sideways glance at Woody, and he laughed. "Okay, I do have a small tattoo. Can't get anything past her." "What do you mean, point of power?" Steve asked. "A lot of people think there's only one kind of power, position power, and if you don't have it, you're a puppet of those who do," Woody explained. "I've heard that before," Steve said as he winked at Kayla. "That kind of thinking is very limiting, isn't it?" "It sure is. The best way to explain that is to demonstrate how we activate points of power around here," Woody said. "Come on." He waved for them to come along as he led them to the service area. Steve was enthralled by the hubbub of activity. Mechanics joking, complaining, carrying on, cycles being rolled and towed and lifted, roaring engines being tested, customers questioning, concerned and nervous about the prognosis. Woody explained, "When people bring their bikes in here, it's not as though they're bringing their motorcycles to a service department. It's more like they're bringing a child to the emergency ward. Our wrenches, mechanics as laypeople call them, obviously have knowledge power. They are experts at fixing Harleys. But they've also got personal power, their ability to give assurance to people and make them feel comfortable with the work that needs to be done and the costs involved." Kayla helped everyone understand that their personal power enhances their knowledge power. That combination has made us incredibly successful. With that comment, one of the sweaty and soiled mechanics called over from his workbench. "Before Kayla worked with us, no one thought mechanics had much personality, let alone personal power. But look at us," the mechanic said with a smile. "We're actually quite charming." Everyone smiled. Steve admired their easy camaraderie. "Come on," Kayla said. "Let's go meet Jim, head of sales. He has some interesting ideas about relationship power." They found Jim in the showroom. As soon as Jim saw them, he walked over and gave Kayla a hug. "Checking up on us, huh? Let me show you something." Jim pulled a rumpled piece of paper out of his shirt pocket and proudly pointed to a list of numbers. "Look at these results from our latest customer sales and service report." Kayla took the report from Jim and held it so that Steve could read along. "This is an incredible improvement over last time," Kayla noted. "What changed?" "I've been in sales all my life, so I knew that relationships were vital. But somehow I got caught up in product information. I mean, it's easy to do when you love the product you're selling. I finally realized that I am good in sales because of my personal power, my people skills. People are my passion and I've built an incredible network. When I started to focus on those relationships, my sales and customer satisfaction increased. Sure, we sell and service Harley-Davidsons, but we're really in the people business." "What exactly do you mean focus on relationships?" Steve asked. "I began to see I had relationship power through my wonderful contacts, customers who were already happy with me, and the dealership. I started cultivating those relationships and asking for leads. One relationship led to another. Now my problem is I have all these great relationships and people who want to buy, and I have no motorcycles left. We've already sold out our annual allocation." "That's a nice problem to have," said Steve. "Let me ask you more about relationship power. I see how it works in sales, but how does it work in other parts of the shop?" Jim discreetly pointed to a young woman working in the merchandise section of the showroom. "See the young woman by the leather jackets? That's Lisa, our apparel and accessories buyer. She's the daughter of the owner of the dealership. That's relationship power." Steve frowned. "I'm not sure most people would find nepotism a positive use of power." "Ah," Jim said thoughtfully. "That's where most of us go wrong. We don't acknowledge our power because we're afraid of what others might think. But having power means you have a choice to use it or not. It certainly doesn't mean you have to abuse it." When we first started discussing the issue of power here at the shop, Kayla asked each of us to write down what we thought our points of power were. Lisa didn't have Dad down on her list. We all told her she should. She protested. She said she wanted to succeed on her own merit, not just because she's the owner's daughter. She was very sensitive about it. You know what I told her? "Fool. If my dad were the owner of the shop, I'd take advantage of it. You can talk to him and get information that the rest of us can't. If you use your relationship power to do a better job and help the shop, then that's using your power in a positive way, and we'll all be grateful, not jealous or resentful." "Lisa got the job because it's her dad's business," Kayla added, "but she keeps it because of her knowledge and personal power." Steve nodded. It was something he'd have to think about. You don't have to agree with everything, Steve. Just take it into account, said Kayla. Woody grabbed Steve's arm and led him down the hall. Speaking of accounts, let me introduce you to Dee Dee, our bookkeeper. Approaching the bookkeeper's desk, Steve said, Nice to meet you, Dee Dee. In what way are you powerful? Dee Dee either didn't notice or chose to ignore the hint of irony in Steve's voice. I have task power, she said confidently. I used to think I was a low person on the totem pole around here. I mean, my job is the only one that doesn't deal directly with motorcycles. But I was wrong about that. Jim jumped in. Dee Dee really runs this joint. She's the one who cuts paychecks, withholds taxes, pays expenses, invoices our customers, and manages our bank accounts. Hard to believe she didn't see herself as having any power. I used to think the power was held only by people like our owner, people who have position power, said Dee Dee. So did I, said Steve. But now I understand there are many forms of power. Acknowledging the power you have gives you a sense of control over your job and your choices, said Dee Dee. I appreciate my work much more now, even though I don't have position power. Are you implying there's no need for position power? Asked Steve. I hope not. At the sound of the voice, they all turned around. Standing behind them was a well-built man with a grey ponytail down his back. The man extended his hand to Steve. Nice to meet you. I'm Hal, the owner of this shop, and I'm here to tell you that position power is a good thing to have. But I've learned a great lesson. The best leadership situation is where you have position power and never have to use it. Like money in the bank, even though you never need it, it's nice to know it's there. Besides, it's better to have people work with you, not for you. Hal pointed to a plaque on the counter. This is our leadership credo, he said. There's only power in empowerment, if you are a self-leader. That credo must work, Steve said. Hal's Harley is legendary, and I now know why. You have all kinds of self-leaders around here. They sure do, said Kayla, and one of the ways they become effective self-leaders is by understanding the 5 kinds of power. With that, she pointed to a poster on the wall. Position power, task power, personal power, relationship power, and knowledge power. As you can see, Kayla continued, the first point of power is knowledge power, as Woody has. Second is personal power, as the service reps have. Third is relationship power, as Jim and Lisa have. Fourth is task power, as Dee Dee has. And fifth is position power, as Hal has. Steve furrowed his brow. I think I get it now, he said. You need to know the nature of your strengths, your power, before you can lead yourself. That's right, Kayla said. How can you lead yourself if you don't realize that you have sources of power? Everyone has different types of power in their lives and work. Kayla paused a moment to let that sink in. Each point of power can contribute to your success, or become the weak link. When I found you on the side of the road, it was a simple little spark plug that had disabled a powerful, complex machine. The message is, identify and recognize your points of power and cultivate them. But it's important to remember what the philosopher Balthasar Gracian wrote. The sole advantage of power is that you can do more good. That's the first time I've ever heard power discussed as a tool for doing good, Steve confessed. Kayla nodded knowingly. How can you do more good for yourself, your family, your team, your organization, or your community if you don't have power? I see your point, said Steve. As they headed to the exit, Steve realized he'd been to dozens of motorcycle shops, but had never enjoyed hanging around one as much as he had this day. It wasn't just the hardware, noise, activity, and smells he loved. He realized it was the people he really enjoyed. These were enthusiasts, folks who loved what they did every day. They were people who had a sense of their unique points of power. As he passed the parts counter, Steve waved goodbye to Woody. Don't forget your parts, Woody said, pointing to a brown paper bag sitting on the counter. Oh yeah, thanks. And speaking of thanks, where'd Kayla go? Steve asked as he looked around the showroom. Woody glanced around and shrugged his shoulders. Don't know, he said, as he put the receipt in Steve's bag. Hey, it was great to meet you. Ride safe. Outside the shop, Kayla's motorcycle was gone. Steve reached into his bag for the replacement parts and pulled out what he thought was the receipt, but instead it was a paper slip with the printed message, The second trick of self-leadership. Activate your points of power. Steve shook his head in wonder. Was there no end to Kayla's tricks? He fired up his big V-twin and notched it into first gear. As he roared away, he could hear Kayla's voice in his mind. Perhaps your greatest assumed constraint is not realizing your own power. He would think about that later, when he figured out what to do about his job. For the moment he didn't want to think. He just wanted to ride. No, he needed to ride. It made him feel powerful.